This lecture turns eastward to South Asian art before 1200, looking to the first cultures in this region, the Indus, the Vedic, Mayura, Shunga, early Satavahana, and the Kushan. Now, South and Southeast Asia make up a range of geographies, climates, religions, as well as different cultures, largely depending upon the accessibility to trading routes and their exposure to other cultures through trade or colonization. Now, through geography, we have a broad range of ethnic communities with these different political units, languages, and cultures. The trade networks, however, would expose all of these to similar ideologies and religions, namely Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam, as we will discuss, the dominant cultural forces in South and Southeast Asia. Annually, we find that rains or monsoons are going to flood the various areas here in South and Southeast Asia, providing a great deal of agricultural output from their proximity to the ocean. Therefore, you can sustain a very large population with the amount of food one can grow in this very wet climate. Now, because of their wealth and accessibility to the ocean, they are vulnerable to colonization, and invasion, immigration, and colonization, such as that seen in India with the British Raj set up between 1858 and 1947 to exploit India, its peoples, and resources. The rich diversity found here of artistic heritage is going to be shown through local commissions by these colonizing invaders as well as indigenous peoples. South Asia is actually part of the Indian subcontinent and is made up of India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka in the far southeast. The Himalayas to the north press into Asia, producing the world's highest mountains, which forms a protective barrier to the north, thus, of course, cutting off India and South Asia from China. This is going to form Nepal and the mountainous region in between. Thus, we have a type of natural barrier, which forms cultural differences and linguistic and religious differences between these two regions that are so close together. Southeast Asia, on the other hand, is part of the Asian subcontinental plate and is divided into two regions. Number one, we have the peninsular portion of Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. And secondly, we have the islands to the southeast of Brunei, East Timor, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Now, turning to the first civilization that we have in the east, that is the equivalent of Mesopotamia in the west, that is the Indus Valley civilization that is going to be housed around the city of Harappa. Hence, it is called the Harappan civilization, which is fed by and supported by the Indus River, just as the Nile or the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are so essential for civilization in the west. Harappa is a civilization around the city of Harappa that flourished between 2600 and 1900 BCE. It is the first discovered site of settlement in the East, and it contains uniform ancient cities and a coherent culture with a system of writing that we have yet to translate. It is at the same time that we find the Egyptian Old Kingdom flourishing, along with the Minoans in ancient Aegean cultures and the Babylonians in the Near East. The discovery of dozens of these seals left by impressions of various types of animals, human figures, and goddesses led to excavations in the 1920s when Mohenjo-Daro was discovered, which is the best preserved city in this early Indus Valley civilization. Here at Mohenjo-Daro, we have the Harappan civilization shown here in a well-preserved city with a citadel that is a walled fortification, elevated 50 feet high above the surrounding area, surrounded by a massive wall. It is two-storied with its houses around a central courtyard made of fired brick. The citadel is much like that seen at Hattusha for other civilizations like the Hittites, as a fortified palace. Hence, of course, it imposed its will and protected its resources from surrounding tribes. Its grid-like plan is laid out with wide avenues and narrowed streets, as seen here from the satellite surveillance photo. Thus, it is going to be an agglutinative architecture that is quite common seen in the West as well. The network of drainage systems would channel waste, human and animal, along with rainwater out from the city. Hence, we have a natural irrigation system, which of course would not even be bested in the Renaissance by early modern cities. We have a watertight pool near the center of the civilization, which could have been used either as a public bath or for some ritual function, much as with baptism in the Christian tradition. That's why it is known as a large water tank, for its use is unknown because we have yet to translate the language of this early civilization in the Indus Valley. Now, the civilization peaked in the 500 years between 2500 and 2000 BCE, to where it grew to 6 to 7 square miles, supporting a population of 20,000 to 50,000 people. A very impressive city indeed, even comparing it to the Sumerians in the West, or we should say the Babylonians at the same time. The lack of information of this region, however, we know nothing about their politics or their religion because their writing is untranslated. But what we do know is they were very influential for later civilizations in India. The continuity of this culture is maintained through the seals, which would influence these later social and religious practices, whether it be ensuring that cows are sacred and or certain goddesses in the Hindu tradition would be worshipped, and or different type of yogic poses. For here we have a man seated in a pose that resembles strikingly later poses by yogis, such as one seen here, whereby the feet would be brought together in the lap. The procession seen in this example before a goddess with a headdress in the upper left shows us that the deities, the customs shown here, would be prototypes for later Indian gods in Hinduism. So just show you, we have all of these people brought together for the ceremony with this divine entity at the top of this carving, not unlike what is seen in the West at the time. Turning to the torso of a priest king, for we do not know exactly what the organization of the city was, but the likelihood that it was similar to how the West developed is certainly possible. And here we have a possible ruler, one of these priest kings who spoke for the gods and or was a high priest. At Mohenjo-Daro, the characteristics in the human figures are as follows. They would have low foreheads, a broad nose, very thick lips, and originally the trefoil designs or three-lobed floral designs on the shirt exposing the right shoulder, not unlike that seen at Lagash, is going to be painted red originally, with the eyes inlaid with colored shells, so they would be reflective, much like the same way we have inlaid shells in the rulers' portraits in the West, such as the Akkadians, which would have had these jewels that would reflect light in the eyes. Now again, we have this notion, much like the Mesopotamians, that rulers would have beards and that would associate them with different qualities, such as in the West that would associate one with bulls, and certainly bulls would remain a very powerful symbol to the cultures in the East. Here, with the male torso from the Harappa civilization, the Indus Valley, we have this very lifelike rendering that emphasizes the soft texture of the body, frontally facing here. This foretells the aesthetic attributes later in Indian art, hence the soft, rounded bodies, and the nudity especially, which is not found in Western counterparts at the time. We do not see in 2600, for instance, the figures being shown, either male or female, nude. Not till later, when we have the goddess Ishtar, do we have this ennobled nudity that is going to arise. This is going to be much closely aligned with the Hellenistic interest in the human body that would spread throughout the ancient world. The Greeks would be the ones that would show nudity, not the Egyptians, not the Mesopotamians. And so this is going to show a very different type of culture that celebrates sensuality and eroticism, as will become clear here shortly. Now, the Vedic period, as it is known, around 2000 BCE, finds that nomadic herdsmen, known as Aryans, are going to come to India from Central Asia. They would introduce to this culture the horse and chariot, writing in Sanskrit, a hierarchical social order with a religion centered around fire sacrifice to the gods. This Indo-European approach to culture, or Aryan, would have a trifunctional hypothesis that we still use today to understand this culture. And it has a three-caste or three-class system, whereby at the top we have priests who are in charge of the gods and all divine aspects of life. The second level will be made up of warriors who protect and reinforce this culture. The third of producers, like food and craftsmen. Hence, the pyramid is similar to all of the other cultures we've looked at in this class, only in India it becomes much more rigid and inflexible, and it is going to turn into something that one is born into in the caste system, and you cannot work your way up or out of it. This is going to be important for understanding Brahmanism, which would turn into Hinduism as we now know it. In Brahmanism, which is centered around the eternal one known as Brahma, you're going to have the Vedas. The Vedas are going to be the first sacred writings or hymns to the gods, much like the hymns that Hesiod is going to write for the Greek gods, for instance. Here we find that fire sacrifice would be overseen in Brahmanism by the priesthood known as Brahmins. Now, the religiously sanctioned caste system also comes from this tradition. Hence, the three different divisions is the divine will of the gods, and they are spoken through the Brahmins. Now, over time, this structure, as noted, becomes hereditary and immutable. You're born into the priestly class, you die in the priestly class. Or you're born into the class of producers, like most people in this culture, and then you die in this caste. The religious tenets of Brahmanism are as follows, and are going to be very important for Hinduism and Buddhism to follow it. Number one, that we have the unity of the individual and the divine, that you do not separate any one of us from the divine world. Therefore, the material world is illusory. We are all divine, and this is merely just going to be an illusion that is distracting us. Secondly, that only the universal divine, or the Brahman, is real and eternal. So we have this notion of a universal divine essence or spirit. Third, that we have samsara, or the existence of the notion that life is cyclical, that we're born, we live, we die, and are reborn. Thus, like later religions that would replace this, like Hinduism and Buddhism, we should aspire to liberate ourselves and reunite our soul with the eternal, universal Brahman. Now, the next religions to come along that challenge this notion of the authority of the Vedas, or sacred writings, and the priesthood that protected it would be Jainism and Buddhism. These would be communities of monks that would separate themselves from worldly concerns or practice an ascetic life. Hence, they rejected this notion of central authority and sought out the divine on their own. Much like monks in the Western tradition in Europe and in Egypt and the Middle East, such as Coptic Christians would separate themselves from everyday life and seek out God in these monastic communities. So this is going to be a tradition that transcends any one region. From 700 to 300 BCE, there was no central power, and regional governments are going to rule until the Mayura dynasty or period, which lasts from 322 to 185 BCE. During this, we find that, at the time of Ashoka, a series of columns will be erected to show the spread of Buddhism and the king's allegiance to it. The Ashoka, who was the third Mayura king, who ruled from 273 to 232, is going to spread Buddhism across the entire range of his empire, that is modern-day India. The Ashokan pillars that he erected would be at Buddhist monasteries and were 50 feet high. The inscriptions accompanying them relate the rules of Dharma, which are moral rules that keep the universe from descending into chaos and to ensure that justice prevails. Here we have a lion capital from one of these Ashokan pillars, in this case from Pradesh, India. Now, the animals are often going to be shown on these capitals that are standards associated with royalty that symbolize the axis mundi, or axis of the world, where the earth is going to be joined with the cosmos. In this instance, we mark the site of Buddha's first sermon with 4 addorsed or back-to-back Asiatic lions, pointing or directed to the 4 cardinal points or directions. The base is going to be an inverted lotus blossom with a platform on which the lions stand, being made up of a bull, a horse, a lion, and an elephant, all between chariot wheels. These are symbols of military might and kingship. The lotus blossom is significant in Buddhist symbolism, for we find that it is going to grow in a particular and predictable pattern that also is meant to parallel, as seen in Buddhism, the progress of the soul from the primeval mud of materialism where we all live, through the waters of experience that finally allow us to break through to the bright sunshine of enlightenment above in the final phase of this type of growth. Hence, the lotus blossom is very important for understanding Buddhism and a Buddha himself. Now, Buddha's sermon is known as a lion's roar, and we find it's often accompanied by lions who are roaring and a wheel. Now, the wheel, importantly for Buddhism, references Dharmachakra, or the wheel of law. Now, this is political, for it relates the king to Buddhism, as a lion, elephant, horse, and a bull are all royal symbols of kingship and military power. The king is seen here and relates himself as a Chakravartin, or a universal king whose chariot wheels pass everywhere. Just as in the West, this association of lions and kingship is going to be very well established and far-flung from Mesopotamia all the way to Western Europe. Now, we find that in the West, the notion of having a column commemorating and relating to military and political victories is going to begin with Trajan, and every emperor after him had to have one of these carved columns. Ashokan pillars are also erected at Buddhist monasteries, like the one at the Great Stupa. Now, before continuing on, we should discuss how Buddhism emerges and what the central tenets of the religion are. First, we should note that Prince Siddhartha Gautama left his palace as a member of the royal family at the age of 29. He then lived and meditated as an ascetic in the wilderness for 6 years, attaining enlightenment at Bodh Gaya in India, where he became Buddha, capital B, which is known as the Awakened One. He then spread 4 noble truths. Number 1, that life is suffering. Number 2, that suffering has a cause, and that is ignorance and desire for material things in this world. 3, that ignorance and desire can be overcome, however, and extinguished. And 4, to overcome ignorance and desire, we must follow the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is as follows, and requires right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Now, importantly, this is often misunderstood, but anyone can become a Buddha, lowercase b, who is not a god, but instead someone who gains enlightenment and is able to break the cycle of samsara, or of life, death, and rebirth in this world, to eventually move on with enlightenment and freeing your soul. At his death, a Buddha and Buddha himself is going to set up these monasteries and temples, the oldest of which is going to be from Sunga and Sarahata periods in 185 BCE to 200 Common Era. Stupas are going to be Buddhist monuments, which are made up of solid mounds enclosing a relic directly associated with the Buddha, one of the most holy of which being his very ashes. Here we have this hemispherical mound with an umbrella above this mast and supported by it, with toranas and this entryway of stairs leading up to railings that encircle the base of this dome. The plan itself is known as a mandala, or a diagram of the cosmos envisioned in Buddhism. There are 4 entrances corresponding with the 4 cardinal directions. The first of these stupas was erected to house the ashes after the cremation of the Buddha, but was later divided into 8 portions relating to the 8 proper paths. Kings divided them further and encased them in burial mounds, much like we do in the Middle Ages, the early modern period, and today with saints and popes. The mandala, or cosmic diagram, will be important for any culture that is going to practice Buddhism and is going to be central to their architecture and their design as well as their visual arts. You would have with it a circle inscribed within a square. Now, the stupas are much like cairn hills, or artificial hills honoring the dead in the Neolithic areas and period in Western Europe, whereby we have this mound of dirt that is going to be over a burial site. Just like in the ancient world and Mycenae, we find that the wealthy Mycenaeans are going to have a dromos that leads us to, as an entry hall, a tholos, or a circular tomb with an interior room where the dead can be found and seen. So the notion of venerating a body in order to attain nirvana, liberating one from rebirth, is made possible by circumambulating this structure clockwise. In the Ashokan period, the great stupa at Sanchi is going to be made a part of a very large Buddhist monastery. Here we see the entryway with additional carved relief with figures on it, as well as the same royal iconography we saw in the Ashokan period with the columns. So we see the lions, the 4 cardinal directions relating to Buddha's speech as a lion's roar, as well as wheels relating to the notion of dharma in the same way. The stone railing is actually added a century later after its original founding in the 3rd century BCE, and then allows us to circumambulate, just like we would at the Dome of the Rock, walk around the rock from which Muhammad ascends on his night journey to heaven. Like the Mycenaean dromos, we find that it is built up from rubble and dirt and faced with dressed stone covered with white plaster and seashells, thus to give it that iridescent gleaming effect that we find Buddhist art will so often have. The mast at the top has 3 stone discs known as umbrellas, and they relate to the 3 jewels of Buddhism: Buddha himself, law, and monastic order. The 3-partite or tripartite system of symbolism here would be familiar to those also in the West who had the same interest in 3s, like the Holy Trinity. Buddha's statues are going to be added much later and are not showing the human form of Buddha in any of his artworks before the 1st century BCE. Instead, Buddha is going to be shown by way of his absence in this way. He has left this world. Hence we see his footprints, empty seats, and planks. The Torana, or stone gateway, here we have the East Torana, for instance, at the great stupa at Sanchi, is going to be made in the 1st century BCE as we slowly start developing more iconography and symbolism associated with Buddhism. Here we have decorative carvings that only exist on the gateways with a continuous narrative of Buddha's life, boast of course his life as well as his past lives, or the Jataka tales. Buddha is shown here leaving his palace for the ascetic life in this relief, in this continuous narrative. He then is going to have gods carry his horse to help him on his journey. Whereas finally, Buddha dismounts as we see his footprints off to the right-hand side. So we still do not show him as an entity necessarily before this period, only his presence or absence. The freestanding sculpture is going to also illustrate the evolution of Indian sculpture in general. Here we have elephants in this female form with fruit. This Yakshi bracket figure is going to be important because this female spirit who is responsible for the reproductive forces of nature, the male equivalent is a Yaksha, is going to emphasize the fertile and reproductive aspects of femininity, as we have very large breasts and emphasis on the inverted pubic triangle and rounded forms. Now, unlike the Greeks, who in the East are going to avoid showing the female form and are going to cover up early on the kore as opposed to the koros, we find that this is not the case in the East. That we have this notion of a very active and sensual figure here who is dancing, with no clear distinction between whether or not she is clothed or nude, as we see the outline of the vulva and her breasts here and her abdomen and belly button, all of which are going to be shown, as well as the skirt that she wears. As seen to the right with the female figure holding a fly whisk from 250 BCE, this tradition of fleshy forms and nudity is going to carry on in India. As we saw going back to the original civilization that is going to found this area, that nudity is something that is central to their art and aesthetic. In the West, this development of nudity is going to begin in the male form and becomes more sensual as time goes on, before finally revealing female nudity. So we do have this disjuncture, which happens in the ennoblement of nudity in the West for the male and preference for the male form. Here we have the symbolism seen in this Yakshi bracket figure, whereas the mango tree represents fecundity or fertility, the production of life. The guardian figure here is related to inclusiveness in Buddhism. Even the deities, right, are understood to be of benefit in other religions according to Buddhism. Turning to the next civilization in the Kushan period, which lasted between 100 and 240 Common Era, we have nomads or Kushans that come from northwest China that are pushed out by the Han. They are moving downward to South Asia and India and set up their own empire. Here they are shown as bearded warriors and kings that are tolerant of religions and various artistic heritages, and they sponsor art that is taken from Hellenistic, Persian, and Indian descent. They also sponsor the first depictions of Buddha. Now, Buddha is going to be identifiable after the 1st century BCE with a specific set of iconographic conventions, but the lotus flower, the chakra, and the elongated earlobes, urna, and ushnisha are the most important that we'll discuss now. Here we have a standing Buddha figure from the 2nd and 3rd century Common Era, very large. We have the legs missing, but it still is 7 feet 6 inches tall. This consistent iconography that is developed is already in place here, as Buddha wears a monk's robe draped over his left shoulder, showing us his ascetic lifestyle as a monk separating himself from society. The lakshanas, or 32 marks on his body, are going to be as follows that identify him as the Buddha, not merely a Buddha. The golden-colored skin is one of these, laid out in poems and in verse, as well as his long arms are as well. The chakra wheels are often shown on his palms and on his feet. In different poses one can see them. The urna is the mark between his eyebrows, as well as long earlobes are going to be shown hanging down, a remnant of and reminder that he was a prince and dressed in finery and jewelry early on. Whereas the ushnisha is the protuberance of the top of the head, or the topknot, which represents enlightenment, that being elevating ourselves above the material world in the everyday. Now, in the 4th century BCE, Alexander the Great had spread Hellenistic culture all the way to India, opening up these trading routes. Thus, the ideas from Greece made their way all the way to this period in the Kushans. The superhuman bulk that we see here, this massive statue of Buddha that is over 7 feet high, is going to be taken from Hellenistic sculpture with the broad and heavy massive forms, these heavy shoulders, a well-defined torso, a bent knee, and one relaxed. Hence, he is in a contrapposto pose. A Western Greek idiom here is going to be shown. The drapery, interestingly enough, comes by way of contact with Romans and the togas that they wear, and the understanding this will be adopted by Buddhists as part of the dress that they have for monks. Now, turning to the Mathura style, we have the second major style of Buddhist art. And here we have Buddha and attendants that are going to be found in the Mathura period in India at Pradesh again. This one created in the late 1st and early 2nd century Common Era. This is not influenced by Hellenistic and the Roman tradition, and instead comes by way of the Yaksas, the male-natured deities that were shown in images surrounding the Great Stupa and other stupas or Buddhist temples. Here we find, as an example of this male figure, a royal figure appropriate for Buddha who was royalty, who's shown in a very fleshy fashion, right? The arms, the legs, the chest is not big and bulky and muscular that we saw as in the West with Greek art, but instead has a type of rhythmic, soft, fleshy sensualness that is appropriate for these fertility spirits. Comparing the two, one can easily see the influence the West has on the Buddha standing on the left versus the seated Buddha with attendants on the right. We find that the bulk is much more evident in the standing Buddha. The early images of Buddha, though, we must understand, are going to be in a frontal stance, where he has broad shoulders and wide eyes. This, at least, is going to be common across the board in these various regions in the first two main styles of Buddhist art. Here we find that, unlike the bulky figure inspired by Hellenistic and Roman examples, that the Buddha here is much more inspired by the Yaksha or Yakshi figures that emphasizes fertility and abundance and regeneration. The robe, interestingly enough, just as with the Yakshi bracket figure, does not differentiate between the Buddha's form himself and his body or sheer nudity, for we find here that the left part of his torso is uncovered, leaving his right shoulder bare, but we see just as much of the torso where he's supposedly covered up on the right side, where we find his navel is showing as well as his other nipple. So just as with the Yakshi figure, there is not a differentiation between clothed and naked. The position is going to also be taken from these yogi poses from the Indus Valley civilization, the first one in India. So this is much more a native style that we have here to South Asia, as opposed to one influenced by Western civilizations. So here, just to recap what we have in this image of Buddha, we have two attendants that are shown directly behind Buddha here on his shoulders. The chakra wheel can be seen in impressions on his hands and on his feet as he lifts his hand. The halo with the radiating light is going to be shown with these scallops behind his head, much like a halo in the Christian tradition. The pipal tree behind him is going to be where he sat to gain enlightenment. The celestial beings that hover above show the supernatural significance of his enlightenment and his journey. The Usnisha, or topknot, still is going to reference enlightenment and where he attained it and that he did attain it. Buddha's sermon is going to be identified below with the roaring lions, just like we talked about with the Ashokan columns and or the pillars, with lions and wheels as the primary motifs. The mudra, or the gesture that Buddha is giving here, has him lifting his hand. This mudra means specifically, have no fear. Now, the different hand gestures that Buddha makes are significant, and they all mean something. They come from a system of hand gestures, whereby an action or state of being is referenced by way of where the hand is going to be held, or mudras. The Dhammachakra is going to be the first one here, where we have the thumb and the forefinger interlocking with the other hand, and relates to teaching. Thus, of course, the hands are generally at chest level, where the wheel is set in motion, the Dhammachakra. Number 2, we find with the hands brought together, you have the dhyana, which is relating to meditation and balance. And this gives you the path to enlightenment with one's hands in one's lap, much like in another yogic position. The Vitarka is the intellectual debate pose in which you lift the right hand and place your thumb and index finger together, forming a circle. The abhaya is the have no fear gesture we just talked about, with the right hand raised at shoulder level. Thus, of course, is going to be seen across many Asian representations of figures that are ensuring that we have nothing to be concerned about and that we should relax. The Bhumispasha is going to be where we call the earth to witness the enlightenment of the Buddha, so we point the hand downward. And finally, with the palm facing opened, the Varada, which references charity or the fulfillment of all wishes. Here with the Mathura style, we have this native tendency towards abstraction and geometric abstraction, these flowing lines, sensual curves and motion, along with the penchant for an appreciation of nudity. That is also going to be showcasing one of these gestures that is the Buddha is most known for. Next time, we will continue on with South Asia before 1200, looking at the Gupta, Pallava, and Kloa cultures.